Good morning everyone, hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Now, to start off this video, I actually need to apologize to my tradcats and ortho bros as we Protestants didn't quite finish the job. But 200 years later, here I am reviewing the Desert Tech Quattro lower and Q magazines. Now, before we get into that, if you want to help me out personally, you can actually check out my company, which is now carrying optics at special prices. So go ahead and check that out. And also, of course, Callaway Ballistics, they're the biggest sponsor of the channel by supplying me with ammunition. Now, full disclosure on the Desert Tech Quattro lower is that I did get this from them for free, so I did not pay for it whatsoever, and in exchange, I'm giving them a review. Now, on top of that, I also know Lance at Desert Tech. He is their product manager. Me and him occasionally dispense Managed Democracy, and he also introduced me to Cody from Red Right Hand LLC and Philip from Bear Arms, but more on that later. Now, getting into basics, this is a 7075 forged lower receiver designed to take their proprietary quad stack magazines. Now, they have to be talked about together as you can't separate the lower from the magazine. So while the magazines might have certain characteristics, if the lower is holding them back or vice versa, they're very inseparable. The kit that I received from Desert Tech came with 5 magazines plus a lower receiver insert so that it can be converted to take standard 30-round magazines. However, I don't really see a good practical application for that. It does take a minute to install and uninstall, so it's not like you're going to be hot swapping from your 53-round magazines to standard 30-round mags after you've already burned through your supply. In theory, it does add a little bit of versatility, but I don't think that's why you're buying this lower receiver to begin with, of course, because as the name implies, you want to use those Q magazines. I've had this lower receiver for about a month and I've used it almost exclusively in that time, and I've used it with everything that I have, including this poor man's LSW that I made for Protect and Preserve. Go ahead and check him out. It'll probably be on his channel at some point in the future. And as you might have noticed, I am using it with a binary trigger, which does have some quirks to it. However, I am not going to blame the quirks of the trigger on the lower receiver. So some issues with the trigger, but that's the trigger's fault, not the lower's. Now, in terms of controls, the lower receiver is a full ambi lower, meaning that you have a right side bolt catch, bolt release, and a left side magazine release. Sometimes having a right side bolt release can impact compatibility with certain upper receivers. I've used it with a variety of forged and billet upper receivers, and it's fit just fine with everything that I've tried. Now, the right side bolt catch is a very low profile long lever, which is actually great for me with my small hands because it's much easier to reach than some of the taller designs as it comes back towards the shooter's hand instead of up and away. So again, for my small hands, that actually works quite well. Right side magazine release feels nearly identical to a standard mil-spec lower receiver. It is a little bit larger, nicely textured, nothing really to write home about in that regard. On the left side, I have had some issues with truly ambidextrous magazine releases. However, due to the design of the lower receiver with its large magazine well and the tension on it, it's basically fenced in and very well protected. So unless you mean to hit it, I haven't had it accidentally drop a magazine yet, like I have with some other ambidextrous lowers. For your left-hand bolt catch release, it is slightly bigger and better than mil-spec, but not that much different that it's going to interfere with some upper receivers. The trigger guard itself is slightly enhanced. It has a little bit of a flare to it, which can be nice for gloved or if you have just super-sized fingers. Now, the lower also has a tensioner, which can help with some upper receivers. I never used it as the fit was always pretty good with, again, at least the sample of probably 10 to 12 different uppers that I tried it with. Now, there is one baffling decision on this lower receiver that's designed around higher capacity, is that it's not full auto cut. But it does have a QD cup on the inboard side for some reason. Now let's talk about the Magwell. Obviously, it is extra thick for the Qmags. Technically, it is flared, which is nice for the reloads, but because of the magazine's quad stack to dual feed design, they have these big shelves on either side that like to get caught on everything. So it is flared, which does help with magazine reloads, but then the magazines themselves don't help with reloads, so it's kind of a moot point. That being said, reloads are going to be more of a training issue than a true ergonomic issue, and it is something to get used to. These are big fat boy magazines, and it just feels different than every other magazine on the market. Now, some of you might be thinking the size of the Magwell itself is an issue, as it does add some width. Of course, it is a very thick lower receiver. However, depending on what optic setup you're running, it may still be thinner than whatever you have mounted on top. For reference, my chonky Romeo 8T is still wider than this fat boy lower. So while it is bigger and there might be some scenario you could construct in which that extra width is an issue, for me, whether it's slung or in a bag or just walking around with it, it hasn't been an issue as of this point. Now, getting to the magazines, which again, you can't really talk about the lower receiver without talking about the magazines, as they are inseparable. Now, these are polymer 53 round quad stack magazines to dual feed. Now, one of the best things about these mags is that the size is thicker. However, they have a very similar height to Qmags. They're about 7.5 inches tall, about 6 ounces, and you get 53 rounds in a little bit of a thicker magazine. Now, in terms of spatial and weight efficiency, the Qmags are slightly better than standard 30 round magazines, like 10% better. Now, that is going to vary depending on what ammo you're using, what magazines you're using, but in general, in theory, they are slightly more size and weight efficient. Now, taking apart the magazine is incredibly simple. Push down the detent, slide the plate off, and you will see a ginormous spring and their custom follower. Now, the follower has all sorts of anti-tilt designs built into it, and again, has worked for the most part. Overall, the design is super simple. It's basically just a box that holds a bunch of rounds, and I think overall that's a good thing. Now, getting into issues, I have had one magazine get bound up a couple times and completely fail until you smack it and you fix the jam on the inside of the magazines. This happened twice in the cold on camera, and once at about 75 degrees off camera while I was zeroing it. Now, I should have marked that magazine that failed during the sub-freezing temperature testing portion, so it could have been the same magazine that failed when I was out on a warmer day as well. Again, I should have marked it because it could be that I just have one bad magazine out of the 5 that they sent me. Speaking of the 5 magazines, all of them have a much looser fit in the Quattro lower than a Qmag in any mil-spec lower. They have more wobble in all directions, forward, back, left, and right, which is going to change the feed angle. Now, that's going to be another problem that we'll talk about in just a second. You can also pretty easily over-insert them, so maybe an over-insertion tab is needed. I'm not sure about that one though, if that's actually an issue. Now, getting back to the feed angle issue, some of the magazines will not feed from the ambi bolt release. So with full power springs on a relatively full mag, sometimes that first round just likes to nosedive into the feed ramps and not actually feed. I'm not sure if that's just the extra pressure on the magazines from having 53 rounds in the mag versus 30. In theory, it could be, again, because the feed angle can change depending on how you're holding the gun. So sometimes the round isn't pointed in the perfect direction. So instead of feeding, it just nosedives into the front of the gun. And again, this happened intermittently. It was not a consistent issue, but again, it did happen. And again, you have a very nice bolt release on the right-hand side, but if using it is punishing, well, then it's kind of a problem. So before we move on to logistical concerns, as far as the lower receiver itself goes, I have almost no issues with it whatsoever, other than the fact that it should be full auto pocket cut from the factory so that people don't have to do it later on. Again, if you have a system designed around a higher magazine capacity, it's going to work very well for something that we're going to talk about later on. So it should be full auto cut. Now, unfortunately, the magazines are where I think most of the issues are going to come from. Fortunately, the magazines, it should be a fairly easy inline fix, just to slightly change how they fit in the lower receiver, take up a little bit more room just so that that feed angle stays consistent, and the binding issue on the inside could be just a slight revision to the follower, or it could just be a me problem. Moving on to magazine logistics. The magazines themselves are $45 a mag, which is actually a really good price when compared to other high cap systems. For instance, cheap 60 round magazines or even higher capacity magazines that actually work are going to be $100+ versus $45, which is still very expensive when compared to 30 round magazines, but nowhere near as bad as like D60s or comparable high cap mags. For a full combat load, in theory, you would only need 4 Qmags at $45 a pop versus 7 30 rounders. Now, what is nice about only needing 4 mags to hit that 212 round mark is that with my micro chest rig, if I have 2 in the front shoved into 308 pouches, now they will also fit into double mag pouches. I just happened to order these elastic 308 pouches and they also worked just fine in there. So 2 in the front, 1 in the side, 1 in the gun, that gives me 212 rounds of capacity with not a lot of size and weight, where it would be difficult to shove 7 30 round magazines into the same micro chest rig. Now, the one problem that I haven't solved yet is if you wanted to put one of these on a belt with like an STAC Kiwi pouch or something like that. I'm not sure if there's a system like that on the market yet for mounting one of these on a belt, though I do think the extra thickness would start to cause problems in a belt, so I would probably recommend keeping these up on your chest or other LBE. So again, they are going to work with at least the 308 mag pouches that I've tried, or with double mag pouches, but the world is designed around 30 rounders. You can definitely adapt your individual systems to work around these Qmags, but they simply aren't going to replace decades of buildup and billions of dollars invested in these 30 round systems. So do these have a place in the market? Technically, yes, but not for general use. I simply don't think it's going to make sense for the vast majority of people to switch or even invest in a platform like this. It's going to be at least $500 if you want to get into something like this, $300 for the lower receiver, at least 5 magazines, if not more, to really get the most out of it. And so for most people, if you just need a high cap system, just try and get a D60 or something like that. Now, one thing that I will say is if you are truly looking for a high capacity system, the Qmags will eventually outrun the D60s in terms of price to performance. They're more low profile. They also integrate better with LBE. And honestly, they might be more reliable than D60s anyways, as D60s and other drum magazines aren't perfectly reliable, and the Qmags have been very good. Not perfect, but very good. And again, I could probably get 6 or even 7 of these Qmags stuffed into a standard LBE, whereas with D60s, that would be a little bit more complicated. Now, if you compare these against 40 rounders, I have a bunch of 40 round magazines, but those suck to go prone with, whereas again, an advantage of the Qmags is they're about the same height as a standard PMag, which means going prone is really easy to do. Now, another application for these mags could possibly be 3-gun matches, where the extra 23 rounds can be the difference between reloading and not, which will definitely shave off some time. And again, if you're comparing these against D60s, the reliability is probably the same. So outside of those very niche applications, I don't see it making sense for the average prepared citizen. Now, getting back to a good use case for these is going to be Cody at Red Right Hand. He's really pushing the civilian auto rifle LSW systems. He makes some dedicated uppers and systems that work for not only high rates of fire, but also high volumes of fire as well. And he has a lot more time on these than I do. And I know that he loves the system and he's having great luck. And again, for that application, for a truly high volume, high rate of fire system, I think that these can work really well, and hopefully they continue to improve them. I do think the mags need a slight tweaking in some way to increase fitment and reliability, and it is also important to note that these are very early on in their public availability. the issues aren't necessarily excusable, but they are understandable. And Desert Tech at this point is kind of known for fixing, improving, abandoning, and retooling into something better. So at the end of the day, are these right for you? I have no idea. So with all that out of the way, guys, let me know what you think of the Desert Tech Quattro Lower and Qmags. Let me know if these are right for you or if you have some sort of application for them. But once again, with all that out of the way, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I will see you in the next one. God bless.